Imagine you're opening up this ancient, heavily traditional religious text. You are totally expecting a dense sermon on Scripture. Maybe, I don't know, some historical commentary on morality.
Right, the usual theological framework.
Exactly. And then suddenly you turn the page and the author just starts lecturing you on the glandular secretions of the adrenal system.
Yeah, it's wild.
Right. You're suddenly reading about neurasthenia, the mechanics of the thyroid, and medieval biological theories about the evolutionary utility of physical pleasure.
It is a profoundly jarring intellectual pivot. I mean, you go from the absolute divine decrees of classical theology straight into what looks like, well, a 19th century medical journal.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are opening up a massive, highly structured religious and legal text that mounts a vigorous, comprehensive defense of the Islamic prohibition of sodomy.
And we should clarify, the mission today isn't just to read the final ruling.
No, not at all. The ruling itself is simple. The mission is to dissect exactly how this specific theological and legal argument is constructed. Because the authors of the sources we are looking at, they don't just say, it's forbidden because the book says so.
Right, they don't just stop at the decree.
Yeah, they attempt to build an impenetrable fortress of logic. They weave together literal scripture readings, absolute historical consensus, intricate debates over penal codes, classical medical claims, and then, as a final maneuver, they launch this direct, highly calculated critique against the texts of rival religions.
But before we begin mapping the blueprints of this ideological fortress, we really must explicitly establish the parameters of our analysis today.
Absolutely crucial.
The material we are exploring deals with intensely charged social, religious, and political themes. So our goal for you today is strictly and entirely analytical. We are not here to endorse, validate, or debate the moral or ethical viewpoints presented in this text.
Right, we're not taking a side here.
Exactly. We are not litigating modern social issues. Instead, we are impartially mapping out the exact architecture of the author's arguments. We're treating this text as an artifact of legal and apologetic reasoning, examining how classical Islamic jurisprudence and modern theological defense mechanisms synthesize entirely diverse fields of thought into a single, unyielding worldview.
So, to start, every legal argument, whether it's secular or religious, has to start at the bedrock. And in this framework, the bedrock is obviously the Quran. But the way the author builds the foundational legal boundary is really fascinating because it doesn't actually start with a specific list of prohibited acts.
Right, it doesn't give you a laundry list of don'ts right away.
Yeah, it starts with a definitive, overarching positive command. The text calls it the rule of the spouses.
Yeah, the author anchors the entire legal framework first in two specific chapters of the Quran, Surah Al-Mu'minun and Surah Al-Ma'arij. If you read these verses, they are basically outlining the comprehensive characteristics of true, successful believers.
Like a profile of an ideal person.
Exactly. And among those characteristics, the verses state that believers are those who guard their private parts except from their spouses.
Or what their right hands possess, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So that establishes the permitted baseline. But the critical legal mechanism comes in the very next sentence. It's this universal catch-all that says, but whoever seeks beyond that, then those are the transgressors.
The transgressors. And the Arabic word the author zeroes in on for transgressors is adun, right?
Yes, adun.
So right out of the gate, the text establishes a strict binary. There's the permitted zone, which is the spouse, and literally any other avenue of sexual expression falls into this massive bucket labeled adun. But a general word like transgressor is legally slippery.
Yeah.
So how does the author tether that broad concept to the specific prohibition of sodomy?
Well, this is where we see the actual mechanics of Islamic exegesis or tafsir in action. You don't just read a verse in isolation. Classical scholars treat the Quran as a fully integrated cross-referential document.
Like a massive hyperlink system.
Yeah, exactly. So the author brings in the linguistic analysis of the famous classical scholar Al-Qurtubi. Al-Qurtubi basically scans the entirety of the Quranic text, looking for other instances of this specific root word.
Right.
And he points out that the Quran uses that exact same term, adun, in a highly specific narrative context, which is when addressing the people of the Prophet Lot.
Wow, okay, so it's a completely closed linguistic loop.
Precisely. In the narrative of Lot, the Quran quotes the prophet saying to his people, "Nay, you are a transgressing people," using the exact root of adun.
Right.
So Al-Qurtubi's argument, which our author adopts, is that linguistically and scripturally, anyone seeking sexual relations outside the permitted bounds of the rule of the spouses is inherently permanently categorized with the people of Lot. The vocabulary creates an inescapable legal bridge.
So if that bridge connects the broad law to the specific story of Lot, we need to look at how the author utilizes that narrative. Because the text leans incredibly heavily on the prophet Lot, or Lanut in Arabic.
It does. It cites the story across multiple chapters: Al-Araf, Ash-Shu'ara, An-Naml, Hud.
Yeah, the author isn't just treating this as a story of generic disobedience, are they?
No, not at all. The author uses the narrative to establish two critical theological precedents. First is the unprecedented nature of the act itself. The text explicitly quotes the verses where Lot asks his people, "Do you commit such immorality as no one has preceded you with from among the worlds?"
So the theological argument here is that this was not some pre-existing human weakness.
Right. The text frames it as a total novel rupture in the natural history of humanity, a sin invented by a specific society.
That phrasing, no one has preceded you, that's doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Oh, absolutely.
It completely removes the acts from the category of standard human temptations and places it into a category of unnatural innovation. And that leads to the second precedent the author establishes, which revolves around the word fahisha.
Yes, fahisha. It roughly translates to a grave indecency, an abomination, or a profoundly shameful act. And the text uses the narrative of Lot to permanently define the act as the ultimate manifestation of fahisha.
And the author doesn't just, leave that word sitting there as a dry legal term either. They pull in a secondary source of Islamic law, the Sunnah, the documented sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, to explain the psychological weight of fahisha.
Right, they want to give it emotional resonance.
Exactly. There is a hadith cited in the sources involving a companion named Sa'd bin Ubadah, and it fundamentally changes how you understand the author's view of divine law.
Yeah, the Hadith of Sa'd bin Ubadah provides a fascinating window into the emotional and psychological framing of this jurisprudence. It moves the law from, a bureaucratic decree to something deeply personal to the creator.
Right, because in the hadith, Sa'd bin Ubadah is talking to the Prophet, and he expresses this intense, almost terrifyingly aggressive jealousy over his wife. He essentially declares that if he ever caught a man with his wife, he wouldn't hesitate. He would strike the man with the sharp edge of his sword.
Which is an extreme reaction.
Yeah. Now, you might expect a religious leader to tell his follower to calm down, maybe rely on the courts. But the Prophet actually validates that intense jealousy. He turns to the other companions and says, "Are you amazed at the jealousy of Sa'd? By God, I am more jealous than Sa'd, and God is more jealous than me."
And then comes the clincher.
Yes, he says, and because of that jealousy, God forbade all indecencies, fawahish, both open and secret.
When you analyze the author's inclusion of this hadith, you see a deliberate attempt to anthropomorphize the rationale behind divine law. The prohibition is framed as a direct manifestation of God's protective, intense jealousy over the moral and spiritual purity of humanity.
Right, so it isn't just that God made a rule.
Exactly. It is that God is fiercely, actively protective of the boundaries he set. The author then brings in the classical scholar Ibn Kathir, who expands on this concept.
What does Ibn Kathir add?
Well, Ibn Kathir notes that the specific punishment inflicted on Lot's people, the raining of brimstone, was the ultimate expression of this divine jealousy over an act that, as the text states, caused men to dispense with women and women with women.
Wow. Let me see if I'm mapping this architecture correctly. The author is essentially treating the Quran and the Sunnah like a constitutional framework.
Okay, go on.
First, they use the broad verses to define a sweeping constitutional category of indecency, or fahisha. Then, they use a specific historical case study, the story of Lot, as the definitive Supreme Court precedent to establish exactly what that broad constitutional word covers in practice.
Right.
And finally, they use the hadith of Sa'd's jealousy to explain the legislative intent behind the Constitution. Does that track?
That is an excellent structural analogy. Textual interpretation in this tradition does not rely on isolated commands. It relies on weaving together the vocabulary of one chapter, the historical narratives of another, and the theological psychology of the prophetic tradition to create a rule that feels historically, linguistically, and emotionally ironclad.
But, a constitutional framework still needs an actionable penal code. You cannot run a functional society merely on historical narratives about brimstone and theological concepts of jealousy.
No, you need laws on the books.
Right. So if you are a judge in an early Islamic court, how do you translate these verses into a working daily legal code?
To find the actionable law, the author moves from the broad strokes of the Quran directly into the highly specific realm of the Sunnah and the concept of scholarly consensus.
Okay.
The text cites a direct, absolute, and highly unambiguous command attributed to the Prophet via his companion, Ibn Abbas. It says, "Whoever you find doing the deed of the people of Lot, kill the doer and the one to whom it is done."
So there is zero ambiguity in that statement. It is a direct mandate for capital punishment.
It is designed to be the ultimate legal stopgap. And to fortify this command, the author invokes heavyweights of classical Islamic scholarship figures like Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qudama to prove the existence of ijma.
Now, ijma is the concept of scholarly consensus, right? But why is it so vital to the author's argument here? If they already have the hadith of Ibn Abbas, why do they need a roster of medieval scholars to back it up?
Because in Sunni Islamic epistemology, a single hadith, even a strong one, can sometimes be subject to contextual debate.
Ah, I see.
But ijma, the absolute, unbroken, unanimous agreement of the Prophet's earliest companions and the subsequent generations of major scholars, is considered an infallible source of truth. The Prophet is reported to have said, "My community will never agree upon an error."
That's a powerful statement.
Right, so by proving ijma on the fundamental prohibition of the act, the author is telling the reader that the foundational illegality of sodomy is permanently locked. It is not up for reinterpretation, revision, or debate in any era.
But the text doesn't stop at just banning the act itself.
Yeah.
This is where the legal theory gets highly preventative. The sources introduce a concept called Saad al-Dariya.
Yes, Saad al-Dariya, blocking the means. If you want to understand the daily practical application of Islamic jurisprudence, you really must understand Saad al-Dariya.
The argument the author makes is that Islam doesn't just ban the ultimate act of transgression, it actively identifies and bans all the conceivable pathways leading up to it.
It cuts it off at the source.
Exactly. If the prohibited act is the center of a target, Saad al-Dariya is the massive fence built miles away from the bullseye. Think of it like a dangerous mountain road. From a strict engineering standpoint, a car could technically take a specific hairpin curve at 80 miles per hour, but the law sets the speed limit at 45 miles per hour.
Right.
They set the limit significantly lower just to ensure nobody even gets close to the physical limits of the curve, accounting for human error, distraction, or temptation.
And the author provides very specific, highly intrusive, practical implementations of this buffer zone. I mean, it regulates daily, mundane physical interactions.
Like what?
Well, the text cites a hadith from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, where the Prophet explicitly forbids a man from looking at the private areas, the ara of another man. And the same rule applies to women looking at other women.
Okay, so a visual buffer zone.
Exactly. Furthermore, the law strictly forbids two men or two women from sharing a single cover or garment without a physical barrier between them.
Wow, so it dictates sleeping arrangements down to the blanket.
Mm-hmm.
And it extends this preventative logic into early childhood development as well, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. The text cites another prophetic command instructing parents to separate the beds of their children when they reach the age of 10.
Right.
Yeah. The author presents all of this not as a collection of random behavioral quirks, but as a holistic, heavily engineered preventative strategy. The underlying legal logic is intensely practical. If you physically and legally block the visual and tactile precursors, the prohibited act itself cannot naturally manifest. You starve the temptation of oxygen.
So if you are reading this text critically, you have to ask what the rhetorical function of all these buffer zones is. It feels like the author is utilizing the sheer strictness of the preventative laws to prove the severity of the core prohibition.
Right, like an indicator of danger.
Yeah, they are arguing, look at the massive legislative footprint required just to keep people away from the possibility of this act. That proves how catastrophically dangerous the act itself must be.
That is exactly the rhetorical utility of Saad al-Dariya in this argument. The width of the buffer zone indicates the danger of the hazard.
But this brings us to a massive, intellectually fascinating friction point in the source material.
Oh, the punishment debate.
Yes. We just spent a significant amount of time establishing that the author claims absolute consensus ijma on the prohibition. Everyone agrees the act is forbidden. But then, almost immediately, the text dives into a sprawling, multi-generational historical legal debate over the punishment.
It seems contradictory, doesn't it?
Completely. If the rule is absolute, and the Hadith of Ibn Abbas says, kill the doer, how is there any room for debate on the penal code?
Well, this friction reveals the deep, often misunderstood mechanics of how Islamic law actually functions. Consensus on the morality or the theological illegality of an act does not automatically translate into consensus on the earthly penal code.
That makes sense.
The text categorizes the historical legal debate into three main schools of thought. Unpacking them shows us the tension between taking texts literally versus prioritizing broader legal principles.
Let's walk through these three schools of thought. How did the greatest legal minds in Islamic history disagree so sharply on a punishment for something they all agreed was a major sin?
Okay, so the first school of thought argues for discretionary punishment, which is technically known as tazir. This view was championed by massive foundational figures like Abu Hanifa, the founder of the Hanafi school of law, which, by the way, is historically the largest legal school in the Islamic world, as well as scholars like Ibn Hazm.
Wait, why would Abu Hanifa argue for discretion? Does he just ignore the hadith of Ibn Abbas? That seems legally reckless.
He doesn't ignore it, but he evaluates its epistemological weight differently than our author does. Abu Hanifa's argument was highly formalistic and cautious regarding capital punishment. He looked at the Quran and noted that while it prescribed specific, fixed punishments known as hudud for crimes like theft or heterosexual fornication, it did not explicitly prescribe a fixed earthly punishment for sodomy.
Right, the Quran was silent on the earthly penalty for it.
Exactly. Furthermore, the Hanafi school has incredibly strict criteria for authenticating a hadith before allowing it to dictate the shedding of blood. They often required tawatur, which is mass transmission by multiple independent chains of narrators, to establish a fixed capital punishment.
And the Ibn Abbas hadith wasn't tawatur.
No, the Hadith of Ibn Abbas, while considered authentic by many, was an ahad or solitary report. Therefore, Abu Hanifa argued, the state cannot execute someone based on a solitary report when the Quran itself is silent on the specific earthly penalty.
Okay, so what is the result?
Consequently, the crime falls to tazir. It is left entirely to the judge's discretion based on the specific circumstances, the severity of the act, and the need for public deterrence. It could be a severe beating, imprisonment, or public shaming, but not a mandatory death sentence.
That is a brilliant legal defense based on the burden of proof. It's really cautious. But the author of our text pushes back incredibly hard against the Hanafi view, don't they?
Strongly. The author attempts to rebut Abu Hanifa's view by constantly returning to the literalism of the Ibn Abbas hadith. For the author, an authentic hadith is an authentic hadith.
Regardless of whether it's solitary or mass transmitted.
Exactly. If the prophet said, kill the doer, that is the prescribed punishment, and it completely overrides the need for judicial discretion. The author essentially accuses the discretionary view of ignoring a direct prophetic command.
So if the first view is judicial discretion, what is the second school of thought?
The second school relies on a fundamental mechanism of Islamic jurisprudence called qiyas, or legal analogy. This view was prominently held by Imam al-Shafi'i, another titan of Islamic law.
Okay.
The Shafi'i scholars argued that sodomy should be treated legally identical to heterosexual fornication, which is called zina.
Wait, if they have the specific hadith of Ibn Abbas telling them exactly what to do, why on earth would scholars like al-Shafi'i try to graft this crime onto the laws for heterosexual fornication? Isn't that legally dangerous to ignore the specific text?
It's all about finding the underlying operative cause, the ilah. Imam al-Shafi'i didn't just guess at punishments. In qiyas, a jurist looks at a new or debated issue and tries to find a legally identical precedent that already has a universally agreed-upon ruling.
So they map the new issue onto an old rule.
Right. Al-Shafi'i looked at sodomy and saw that the underlying physical act, the illicit insertion, was legally identical to zina. Therefore, he argued the punishment must follow the highly complex established rules for zina.
And those rules for zina differentiate based on marital status, correct?
Exactly. In the laws of zina, if the perpetrator is married, the punishment is stoning. If they are unmarried, the punishment is 100 lashes. Al-Shafi'i argued that consistency in the law demanded applying this exact same marital distinction to the act of sodomy.
But again, the author's text completely rejects this analogical approach.
Yes, and the text cites a scholar named Al-Sanani to dismantle the Shafi'i method of qiyas. Al-Sanani brings up a foundational rule of jurisprudence, which is la qiyas ma al-nas. There is no analogy in the presence of a specific text.
Which means the Ibn Abbas hadith trumps everything.
Exactly. The author argues that because the Ibn Abbas hadith explicitly mandates death without ever distinguishing between married and unmarried individuals, trying to map it onto the zina laws is legally void. You cannot use human logic to build an analogy when a specific divine command already exists. The specific text utterly destroys the general analogy.
Which leads us directly to the third view, which is the position the author clearly champions the absolute death penalty.
Correct. This view is attributed to major founders like Imam Malik and Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, and it is the dominant preferred view of the text we are analyzing. Their legal methodology is straightforward literalism regarding the hadith.
So marital status doesn't matter.
Marital status is entirely irrelevant. The lack of a specific Quranic penalty is irrelevant because the prophetic command fills the silence. The act itself, universally, carries a singular penalty of death.
Now, the sources then go into some intensely graphic historical debates about the actual method of this punishment. It is undeniably tough subject matter, but it is central to understanding how these scholars viewed the severity of the crime.
It is tough, yes. The debate over the method of execution reveals how deeply the scholars wanted the earthly punishment to reflect the divine narratives.
How so?
Well, the text notes that because the Quran explicitly says God rained stones of baked clay down on the people of Lot, the majority of scholars in this third camp argued the execution must be carried out by stoning. They wanted the human penal code to perfectly mirror the divine retribution described in the scripture.
But the text also mentions other historical methods that were debated by early Muslim leaders. For instance, it discusses throwing the guilty from a high place, like a wall or a mountain, which it attributes to early companions like Abu Bakr and Ali, followed by stoning them.
Yeah, the logic there was an attempt to physically recreate the concept of a city being turned upside down. The Quranic narrative says God turned the cities of Lot upside down before raining the stones upon them. So throwing the perpetrator from a height was an attempt to replicate that specific geographic destruction on a human body.
But here is a detail in the text that is absolutely crucial for understanding the author's methodology. The text mentions a historical claim that some early Muslims argued for burning as a method of punishment. But the author explicitly stops the narrative to note that the historical reports supporting burning are completely unauthentic and weak.
This is a vital observation. Even while arguing for the absolute harshest possible penalty, the author remains entirely bound by the strict rules of hadith authentication.
The science of ilm al-riyal.
Yes, the science of evaluating the chains of narrators. The author's strict adherence to this methodology forces them to publicly reject a terrifying method of punishment because the historical paper trail isn't solid.
It's like the system polices its own boundaries. It shows that for these scholars, the desire to express outrage or severity is not an excuse to abandon the rigorous science of source authentication. The authenticated text must dictate the action. Raw emotion cannot just invent a punishment.
Precisely. It is a highly formalized system of violence, strictly regulated by the perceived authenticity of historical documents.
Okay, so up until this point, the entire structure has been built on theology, linguistic interpretation, and legal methodology. But here is where the deep dive takes a truly unexpected turn.
The pivot to science.
Yes. The author seemingly realizes that relying entirely on because God said so or because the Hadith demands it might not convince everyone, especially a more secularly inclined reader. So the text ventures entirely out of the courtroom and into the realms of philosophy, sociology, and medicine.
It's a massive shift in the apologetic strategy.
They attempt to prove that the law is not just a divine test of obedience, but that it is inherently, scientifically, and biologically beneficial to the human species.
Right. The author is no longer just defending the law, they are attempting to prove its absolute rationality. To do this, they bring in classical Islamic philosophers, most notably Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, to argue that divine law is merely a perfect reflection of the natural biological order.
Let's unpack al-Razi's philosophy, which the text highlights. He presents what I can only describe as the bait and trap theory of human biology. And when I read this in the sources, it completely blew my mind because of how utilitarian it is.
It is a profoundly utilitarian, teleological view of human biology. Al-Razi looks at the human body and argues that physical sexual pleasure is not an end in itself. God did not create pleasure just so humans could enjoy it.
Okay, then what is it for?
Well, rather, pleasure is merely bait, quite literally like a piece of cheese placed in a mousetrap designed by the creator to achieve a very specific, difficult purpose.
And the trap in this philosophical framework is the incredibly heavy burden of raising children.
Exactly. Al-Razi's logic is that humans, by their inherently selfish nature, would completely avoid the immense physical exhaustion, the financial drain, and the emotional anxiety of rearing children. If left to our own devices, we would not voluntarily undertake the grueling work required to ensure the survival of the human species.
We just opt out.
Right, we'd opt out. Therefore, God engineered the intense physical pleasure of intercourse as the bait. When a person pursues that overwhelming pleasure, they spring the trap, resulting in procreation and the continuation of humanity.
So when the author applies Al-Razi's philosophical framework to the specific prohibition of sodomy,
Al-Razi argues that achieving that intense physical pleasure without any biological possibility of procreation is a fundamental violation of the natural order.
it's effectively stealing the bait while completely bypassing God's trap.
Yes, he deems this inherently illogical, a subversion of divine wisdom, and a direct threat to the survival of the species. Al-Razi goes so far as to argue that engaging in pure pleasure without the utility of procreation reduces a human to the level of a beast, abandoning the higher purpose of human instinct for mere momentary gratification.
The argument essentially boils down to, you are hacking the biological system, and the system administrator God strictly forbids unauthorized workarounds.
That's a great way to put it.
And the text builds on this classical philosophy by quoting a much more modern scholar, Sheikh Mohammed Rashid Rida, who zooms out from biology to macro-sociology.
Yes, Rashid Rida, operating in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, lists a catastrophic cascade of societal harms. He claims the act ruins youth by making cheap, consequence-free pleasure too easily accessible, thereby degrading their moral fortitude and work ethic.
And he had arguments about men and women specifically, right?
Right. He argues it degrades men by introducing what he calls a disease of indignity. Furthermore, he argues it deeply harms women by depriving them of capable husbands, leaving them trapped in unfulfilled marriages or unable to marry at all.
So it affects the whole societal structure.
Ultimately, yes. Rashid Rida echoes the core of Al-Razi's fear, claiming the widespread acceptance of this act leads directly to a catastrophic drop in population and the eventual collapse of a civilization.
But the text goes even further than abstract philosophy and sociology. This is where the author brings in what they claim to be hard medical and psychological science. And if you're reading this from a modern perspective, you might be wondering how a religious author could possibly apply a biological theory to a penal code.
Yeah, it feels disjointed today.
But the text confidently uses the medical vocabulary of its era to back up ancient theology. It claims the act causes severe psychological inversion, listing things like effeminacy, the desire to wear makeup, or fundamentally changing the way one walks.
The author is attempting to pathologize the behavior using the specific medical and pseudo-medical frameworks available to them at the time. The text makes extensive, highly specific claims about physical and mental deterioration. For instance, it claims the act causes severe neurological damage and a total loss of willpower.
Right.
And it specifically links this in a very confident clinical tone to reduce secretions from the thyroid and the adrenal glands.
The adrenal glands, it is so hyperspecific. Why would a theological text care about the endocrine system?
It is an attempt to anchor a moral judgment in the absolute authority of endocrinology. If you can prove that a sin measurably damages a specific gland, the law is no longer just a matter of faith, it becomes a matter of public health.
Wow.
The text goes on to link the act to a widespread 19th century medical diagnosis called neurasthenia, claiming it leads to chronic fatigue, melancholia, idiocy, and an inevitable psychological escalation into other conditions like sadism, masochism, and extreme fetishism.
The author also makes graphic claims about physical damage. The sources mention the tearing of the rectum, the total loss of sphincter control, and vulnerability to chronic lethal infections. And then, seamlessly, the text leaps right back from physical anatomy to pure morality, claiming that perpetrators eventually lose their conscience entirely, leading to unchecked violence or inevitably preying on children.
What is truly fascinating here is the underlying epistemological methodology. The author is not just throwing scary medical terms at the reader, they are trying to prove that divine law is biologically, empirically verifiable in a laboratory.
It's like theology putting on a lab coat and holding a clipboard. I mean, is the author effectively turning religious doctrine into a branch of medical science?
For the author of this text, there is absolutely no separation between the two realms. In their worldview, if the same God created both the immutable moral law and the physical human body, then the moral law must perfectly map onto the physical health of that body.
They're essentially two sides of the same divine coin.
Exactly. If the scriptural text says an act is a transgression, the author fully expects and demands that the adrenal glands, the nervous system, and the digestive tract will physically deteriorate when that boundary is crossed. They are weaponizing the language and authority of science to validate the unquestionable authority of revelation.
That is a wild, intense intersection of faith and biology. But the author's defense mechanism doesn't just rest on fortifying their own territory. In the final, most aggressive section of our source material, the text goes entirely on the offensive.
Right, the rhetorical counterattack.
Yes. First, it plays a tight defense against external critics of Islam, and then it launches a highly calculated attack against the sacred texts of rival religions.
The transition here is a classic centuries-old apologetic maneuver. Before you can attack the foundations of someone else's worldview, you must first seal any perceived cracks in your own foundation.
Make sure your own house is in order.
Exactly. The author takes time to address very specific claims made by critics who argued that certain Quranic verses might contain linguistic loopholes permitting same-sex relations.
Let's look at the first loophole the author tries to violently close. The text cites a verse from Surah Al-Baqarah, which says, "Do not marry polytheists." Apparently, some critics attempted to argue that this phrasing, devoid of gendered pronouns in certain translations, implied the existence or permission of male-to-male marriage.
The author's refutation of this critique is entirely linguistic and grammatical. They do not argue theology here, they argue syntax. They point to the specific Arabic verb used in the verse, which is tunkihu.
Tunkihu.
Yes. The author, quoting major classical grammarians and scholars like Al-Qurtubi and Al-Tabari, explains that the entire meaning hinges on a single vowel pronunciation. With a dhamma on the first letter, making it tunkihu, the verb changes from the active to marry to the causative to give in marriage.
So it is an instruction directed entirely at male guardians.
Exactly. The grammatical reality of the verse means do not give your female wards in marriage to polytheist men. It has absolutely nothing to do with men marrying men. The author uses the extreme precision of classical Arabic grammar to swat away the critic's interpretation, framing it not just as a theological error, but as an embarrassing fundamental misreading of basic Arabic syntax.
It's like arguing over a misplaced comma in a modern billion-dollar corporate contract. One vowel changes the entire legal ruling.
It really does.
And the author does the exact same thing with a verse from Surah Al-Imran, where the Quran says, "Beautified for people is the love of desires from women and sons, and heaped up sums of gold and silver."
Yes. The critic looks at that and says, look, it says the love of desires is beautified for people generally, which could include men desiring men.
And how does the author respond?
The author immediately cites scholars like Al-Shawkani and Al-Alusi to clarify the definition of the word desires, or shahawat. They explain that in this context, the word means things that are desired, the objects of temptation, not the active verb of desiring itself.
Okay, that changes the context completely.
Right. The verse is merely listing earthly temptations, wealth, children, women that humans naturally covet. It is a warning about materialism, not an endorsement of every possible sexual configuration.
So, having meticulously defended their own linguistic turf, the author executes this massive aggressive pivot. The text turns its sights directly onto the Christian and Jewish Bible, and the strategy here is intense. The text methodically attempts to show that the Bible, the foundational text of their most frequent critics, is rife with indecent stories and undeniable same-sex subtext.
This is a rhetorical strategy known in logic and debate as tu quoque, which translates from Latin to you too.
You too. Essentially, don't throw stones from glass houses.
Precisely. By deliberately highlighting narratives in the Bible that sound scandalous, morally ambiguous, or possess what could easily be read as homoerotic subtext, the author aims to completely discredit the moral authority of those who criticize Islamic texts.
Right.
The implicit argument is clear. You attack the strictness of our penal codes and the rigidity of our buffer zones, yet look at the blatant immorality contained within your own sacred scriptures.
And the specific biblical citations the text uses are fascinating because they don't just pick random verses. They zero in on stories that theologians have debated for centuries.
Like the story of David and Jonathan.
Yes. For example, the text brings up the relationship between David and Jonathan from the first book of Samuel. It explicitly quotes the verse where David mourns Jonathan, saying, "Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women." And it specifically highlights the scene where Jonathan strips off his clothes, his robe, and his armor to give them to David. The Islamic text frames this entirely through a lens of heavy moral suspicion.
The author is actively weaponizing the emotional ambiguity of the biblical text. They highlight the intense emotional bonding and the physical undressing to suggest a highly inappropriate relationship.
This is very pointed reading.
It is. They are demanding the reader contrast this ambiguous biblical scene with the strict, unambiguous boundaries established in the Islamic text we discussed earlier, the Sad al-Daria rules that forbid two men from even sharing a blanket.
They apply this exact same strategy to the New Testament. The text points to the Gospel of John, specifically focusing on the anonymous figure known only as the beloved disciple. It highlights the verses detailing this male disciple physically resting or leaning on Jesus' chest during the Last Supper.
Again, the author is taking a moment of ancient cultural intimacy, which biblical scholars argue was standard dining posture in the Greco-Roman world, and intentionally reading it through a modern lens of suspicion.
Just to put the critic on the defensive.
Exactly. The goal is to provoke and disorient the Christian critic by forcing them to defend physical intimacy of their central religious figure.
But the author doesn't stop at emotional bonds or dining postures. They go after the mechanics of prophetic miracles, too. The text sharply criticizes a famous story about the prophet Elisha in the second book of Kings. Elisha resurrects a dead boy, but the Islamic text ignores the miracle and focuses entirely on the method.
The mouth-to-mouth aspect.
Right. Elisha lies upon the boy, putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands.
The author points to this highly physical resurrection and asks the reader, essentially, how can a holy text depict a prophet of God engaging in such intensely intimate, full-body, skin-to-skin contact with a young boy, regardless of the miraculous context?
And then they compare it again to their own rules.
Yes, they juxtaposition this disturbing imagery against the hyper-vigilant preventative rules of Islam that mandate separating the beds of 10-year-olds.
It is a relentless, exhausting critique. The text even brings up the Book of Ruth, pointing out the undeniable sexual subtext of Ruth sneaking into the threshing floor at night, uncovering Boaz's feet, and lying down next to him in the dark until morning.
And Noah, too.
Yeah. Finally, they cite the story of Noah and his son Ham from Genesis. They highlight the narrative of Noah, a major prophet, getting completely drunk and passing out naked in his tent, and his son Ham seeing his nakedness, resulting in a generational curse.
If we look at this from a macro-analytical distance, interreligious debates almost always revolve around this exact dynamic.
How so?
Well, the author is taking the opponent's text at its most literal, its most out of context, and its most scandalous worst, while simultaneously demanding the most nuanced, historically contextualized, and linguistically precise reading of their own text.
It is the ultimate debate tactic. The author is essentially saying, my text requires a PhD in classical Arabic grammar, an understanding of ijma, and a mastery of hadith authentication to properly understand. But your text clearly means exactly what it sounds like.
Exactly. It is intellectually asymmetrical warfare. But within the architecture of this specific document, this biblical critique serves as the final, heavily fortified wall of the fortress.
Making the fortress impenetrable.
Right. It serves to tell the Muslim reader, not only is our law linguistically perfect, scientifically verifiable, and morally sound, but the alternatives provided by other traditions are deeply compromised, morally ambiguous, and inherently flawed.
Wow. Let's take a deep breath, step back, and look at the sheer scope of the ideological fortress we've just traversed in this deep dive.
It's a lot of ground covered.
It really is. We started at the bedrock with the foundational commands of the Quran, the intricate linguistic tethering of the word transgressors to the historical narrative of the people of Lot.
Right, the linguistic loop.
Then we navigated the incredibly complex, sometimes entirely contradictory legal debates over punishment, seeing how brilliant scholars wrestled with textual literalism versus the mechanics of legal analogy and qiyas. We explored Al-Razi's utilitarian mousetrap theory of biology and the bizarre early medical claims about adrenal glands and neurasthenia. And finally, we analyzed the author's rhetorical counterattack on the ambiguities of the Bible.
You know, understanding the architecture of texts like this is absolutely vital, regardless of your personal worldview. It shows us how comprehensive and deeply interconnected religious legal frameworks truly are.
It's not just a list of rules.
No, for the author of this text, theology, jurisprudence, biology, and comparative religion aren't separate, isolated fields of study. They are all interlocking bricks in the exact same wall.
Everything depends on everything else.
Precisely. If you pull out the medical argument, the theological argument feels the stress. If you shift the linguistic interpretation of a single vowel, the entire penal code wobbles. It is a perfectly sealed ecosystem of thought.
Which leaves us with a fascinating, highly provocative thought to mull over for you, the listener.
Oh, absolutely.
If an ancient legal system anchors a significant portion of its moral justification in the medical and biological science of its specific era, like Al-Razi's view of pleasure as a mere biological bait, or 19th century theories on the adrenal glands and neurasthenia, what happens to the architecture of that law when modern biology, endocrinology, and psychology fundamentally change how we understand human nature?
That is the ultimate unresolved question of religious modernity.
Right. Does the law remain completely rigid because the original scriptural command is absolute and untouchable, regardless of the science used to defend it? Or does the shifting sand of human scientific discovery eventually force a redesign of the legal house?
It's a structural dilemma.
Exactly. When the invention of the X-ray machine fundamentally changes how we see the bones, because the ancient medical diagnoses have to change, it's something to think about until next time.